They say New York was built on ambition, but what if I told you it was really built on silence? Not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows a scream no one is allowed to hear. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of Fifth Avenue and the manicured facades of Gilded Age mansions, there lived a woman who turned silence into power and reputation into weaponry. Caroline Astor. The name echoes like a hymn in the annals of high society, but behind her polished legacy lies a history riddled with betrayal, psychological manipulation, and the kind of quiet tyranny that rewrites entire bloodlines. She didn't just host galas, she determined who would thrive and who would be erased from New York's collective memory. The city's elite didn't rise on merit, they rose on the sharp edge of her approval. A pen in her hand was deadlier than any blade, but what if her empire of etiquette masked something darker? A network of secret deals destroyed lives and quiet deaths that never made the papers. Caroline's own family was not spared. One daughter overdosed in her room, another drowned herself in grief. Her only son, John Jacob Astor IV, boarded the Titanic in 1912, never to return. Coincidence? Or punishment for a betrayal we were never meant to uncover? They called it high society. I call it a psychological control system, the velvet kind, the kind where you don't even realize you've been trapped until it's too late. And behind this system was a woman who understood that power wasn't taken, it was bestowed through calculated favor. Caroline was born not into privilege but into burden, the ninth child of a family obsessed with legacy, not love. Her father, a cold shipping magnate. Her mother, a statue of quiet disdain. From her first breath she was watched, judged, and molded, not to live but to rule, to endure, not to feel. Every movement, every word was scripted. And from this trace, Ning came a ruler more dangerous than a tyrant because she didn't need force, she had memory. And in the secret world of Caroline Astor, memory was currency, silence was law. And those who defied her found themselves not just forgotten, but erased. This is not history. This is a crime story, one that still casts a shadow. Welcome to the truth. Caroline Astor's empire wasn't made of gold, it was made of names. And in her world, a name could be your salvation or your damnation. To be invited to her ballroom wasn't just an honor, it was a sentence, a mark of belonging that came with invisible chains. The uninvited, they ceased to exist, socially executed without a single word. Caroline ruled through an ancient, almost priestly knowledge, the genealogy of power. Who your ancestors were, where they were buried, which church pew your family occupied. These were not details, they were weapons, and she wielded them with a ruthless precision that no man could match. Beneath the velvet gloves and lace collars lay a mind that catalogued every social misstep, every whispered betrayal. She didn't need to confront you. All she needed was to close her ledger, and you were done. But her control wasn't born in adulthood. It was forged in the shadows of childhood, in a house that smelled of beeswax, salt air, and secrets. Her mother, Helen, descended from the Van Cortlands, landowners, governors, bloodlines as old as the city itself. Her father, Abraham, a shipping tycoon who trusted no one, not even joy. Caroline was born into stillness. She wasn't praised. She wasn't held. She was observed like a relic of family memory, meant to endure, not to evolve. From the age of 3, she understood that love was conditional, and power came from never needing affection at all. Her world was polished wood and candlelight, portraits of ancestors staring down with cold authority. Her playthings were prayer books and family crests. While other children learned the alphabet, Caroline memorized addresses, family alliances, and who sat where at Grace Church. Her childhood wasn't innocent, it was a training ground, and while her peers danced through youth, she became a watcher, a keeper of social law, unblinking and merciless, but even she could know But stop time. The city changed, new money arrived, loud, eager, gaudy. The Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Astors of another branch. They had money, but no memory. Caroline called them invaders. She saw their mansions rise north of Bond Street, filled with mirrors instead of history, and she made a choice. to draw a line between those who remembered and those who merely bought their way in. It was not a social preference, it was a war, and Caroline Astor would become its general, its judge, and its executioner. But in wars like these, blood doesn't flow in the streets, it disappears behind closed doors. Caroline's war was silent, but its consequences were eternal. New York's surface glittered with chandeliers and champagne, but beneath it pulsed a brutal hierarchy, a cold-blooded system she enforced with surgical precision. The weapon was not violence, it was exclusion, and Caroline Astor became the high priestess of social annihilation. Her guest list, famously capped at 400, was not just a roster of names. It was a line between the chosen and the forgotten. To be included was to exist. To be excluded was to vanish. And she kept the ledger by hand, every name etched in ink, every erasure a quiet execution. But even queens face rivals. Alva Vanderbilt, new money, railroad millions, audacious and cunning, was not content to be locked out. She challenged Caroline's reign, not with politics, but with spectacle. Alva built a palace on Fifth Avenue, dripping with imported marble and gold, and invited everyone Caroline had banned. Monkeys in suits, absurd costumes, wild entertainment. The press called it eccentric. Caroline called it a declaration of war, and in her world, war meant control or collapse. Yet even as she faced Alva's assault, Caroline's house was bleeding. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., flaunted mistresses on his yacht, humiliating her in whispers that echoed through the ballrooms. One daughter overdosed, another drowned in sorrow, and her only son, the heir, the legacy, boarded the Titanic, chasing Europe's glory, never to return. Her personal empire was cracking, even as she fought to keep the city's social order intact. Caroline's enemies whispered that her power was dying, that time itself was turning against her. But they didn't understand her. Caroline did not draw power from her family or wealth. She drew it from the fear she inspired, the fear of being forgotten. Behind every ball gown and bow tie in her drawing room stood the terror of erasure. One misstep, and you were gone. She didn't need to speak. A look, a pause, a name missing from a card. These were her sentences, and everyone knew them. Her gatherings became rituals, not parties, a theater of control where every gesture was judged, every glance measured. Behind closed doors, marriages were arranged, fortunes brokered, reputations buried, and Caroline stood at the center, calm, unmoved, the architect of New York's invisible empire. But empires built on memory face a silent enemy, forgetting, and the modern world was rising, fast, loud, and merciless. Caroline would not retreat. She would fight, even if it meant destroying the very world she had built. Because in her mind, to yield was to die, and Caroline Astor would never die quietly. But Caroline Astor's greatest crime was not one of blood. It was one of erasure. Power in her hands became a form of social execution. She didn't need poison or bullets. She had something far more enduring. Memory control. To be forgotten by Mrs. Astor was to be erased from history itself. Names once whispered in admiration were struck from her ledger like a death sentence. The press followed her lead, society followed her silence, and soon those who once climbed the marble steps of her parlor were never spoken of again. This was psychological warfare at its most refined. Men with fortunes begged for access. Women trained their daughters in the exact science of etiquette, not for virtue, but for survival. Caroline's rules weren't written, but they were absolute. A calling card delivered 5 minutes late, a gown too vivid for the hour, a name mispronounced at tea. These were fatal errors, and she never corrected. She only remembered. Her drawing room became a court, her gaze the gavel, her silence the executioner. Behind her elegance, there was cruelty. She orchestrated marriages like political alliances, not for love, but for the consolidation of lineage. She destroyed women who crossed her, publicly shaming them with cold precision. Men who failed to show proper deference found their invitations revoked, their wives left off guest lists, their influence evaporating, and still the city bowed to her. Because in Caroline's New York, power did not reside in government halls or corporate towers. It lived in parlors, in whispered judgments, in the ice-cold eyes of a woman who never forgot. But the world beyond her walls was shifting. Immigrants poured into the city, bringing new names, new gods, and new ambitions. The Vanderbilts, Stuarts, and Goulds, barons of steel, oil, and rail, had money beyond imagining, but no past, and that made them dangerous. They didn't care for rules. They built mansions without lineage, held balls without permission, and yet Caroline refused to cede. She remained still while the world spun faster, holding the line between old and new like a priestess before a collapsing altar. But how long can silence resist noise? How long can memory stand against spectacle? Caroline's reign, for all its cold brilliance, was becoming a relic, and the city she ruled like a velvet tyrant was learning to forget even her. But before she fell, she would commit her final act of control, one that would silence even the loudest challengers, one that would leave a mark not in stone, but in the minds of every man who feared being forgotten. The final weapon Caroline Astor wielded was fear, not the fear of death, but of vanishing without a trace. In the Gilded Age, reputations were currency, and Caroline could bankrupt a family with a glance. But there was one family she couldn't ignore: the Vanderbilts. Alva Vanderbilt, brash, calculating, and unrelenting, was everything Caroline detested: new money, new morals, and no patience for the slow dance of tradition. Alva didn't wait for an invitation. She forced the door open. In 1883, Alva announced the most opulent ball New York had ever seen, a spectacle of wealth, mirrors, and defiance. And she dared to demand Mrs. Astor's presence. For the first time, Caroline hesitated. Declining would signal weakness. Accepting meant surrender. But Alva's trap was perfect. Her daughter Carrie, desperate for social acceptance, was not invited. Caroline faced a decision: protect her pride or protect her legacy. She relented. Caroline Astor, Queen of Old New York, wrote to Alva. An invitation was issued to Carrie. The unthinkable had happened. Caroline bowed, not to a crown but to cash. That night, in the mirrored halls of Alva's mansion, beneath chandeliers heavier than empires, Caroline appeared, not as ruler, but as relic. She wore her finest silks, diamonds inherited from centuries past, and eyes that betrayed nothing. But something cracked inside her. In that moment, power shifted, not with a scream, but with a sigh. And yet, Caroline would not die quietly. She crafted a list, a ledger known only to her and her inner circle. The 400. 400 names deemed worthy of New York society. 400 souls saved from social oblivion. And with this list, she drew a line in blood between the chosen and the condemned. It wasn't just a guest list, it was a map of survival. To be excluded was to be erased. The press devoured it. The public speculated. No one knew how it was chosen. Listen only that it was final. But the truth, that list was a lie, a distraction. Caroline's real power wasn't in who she included, it was in the secrets she kept about those she excluded. Affairs, debts, betrayals, she kept them all, locked away in her mind like weapons, ready to be used if anyone dared challenge her again. Caroline Astor had lost a battle, but the war for memory had just begun, and behind her cold smile, a darker plot was already unfolding, one that would stain the city forever. What the public never saw was the archive, Caroline's true instrument of control. Hidden in a locked room of her Bond Street mansion behind mahogany panels and velvet drapes, she kept meticulous records. Handwritten notes, sealed letters, coded ledgers, all chronicling the sins of New York's elite. This was no diary. It was a ledger of leverage, a catalogue of every indiscretion traded behind the lace curtains of Fifth Avenue. Caroline called it the Quiet Book. Inside it, names, dates, betrayals. A senator's hidden affair with an actress. A railroad magnate's secret debts to foreign banks. A clergyman's son caught in an opium den. And not merely observed, documented, verified, preserved. Each entry a thread she could pull to unravel lives. She never blackmailed, never needed to. The mere whisper that Caroline knew was enough to keep the mighty in line. But then, in 1892, a fire erupted in a warehouse near the docks. Seemingly random, blamed on faulty lamps. Yet the warehouse was owned by a discreet trust tied to Caroline's family, and within it were duplicates, carbon copies of some of the quiet book's most damning entries, kept as insurance in case her home was ever breached. The fire erased them all. At least, that's what the public believed. The official report listed it as an accident, but whispers emerged that the fire was deliberate, that someone had discovered Caroline's hidden archive, that she had enemies not just in society, but within her own bloodline. Caroline's son, Jack, had begun to question her authority. His lifestyle was reckless, debauched parties, questionable investments, and an unsettling closeness with Alva Vanderbilt's circle. Caroline feared he had betrayed her, not with words, but with access. The fire might have been Jack's warning, or his revenge, but Caroline, undeterred, withdrew deeper. She stopped attending public events. The Bond Street Mété became a fortress. Curtains never opened. Servants replaced with loyalists. Only a select few were ever admitted, and even they were watched. Some say Caroline began to lose her grip, that the weight of secrets drove her to paranoia. But others believe it wasn't paranoia, it was preparation, because Caroline Astor knew something was coming, a reckoning, and she was determined to face it not as a victim, but as the architect. The city had taken much from her. She was about to take something back, something no fire could destroy. Fear. By 1895, fear had become Caroline Astor's final currency. Her enemies no longer mocked her. They feared her. They feared what she knew, feared what she might release, and feared most of all what she had hidden away. But while her mansion grew darker, more silent, the city outside pulsed with chaos. Wall Street trembled under waves of speculation. Labor strikes erupted like wildfires. The new rich, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, moved with brazen impunity. Old New York was being gutted, and Caroline stood alone at the gates, trying to hold back the tide. Her son, Jack, had become a stranger. He married without her consent, a scandalous match with a young socialite half his age, defiant, headstrong. Caroline refused to attend the wedding. In retaliation, Jack cut off her access to certain family holdings, using his legal position to restrict her influence. But that wasn't the true betrayal. Months later, Caroline received an anonymous parcel. Inside, a single page from the quiet book, marked with Jack's initials alongside notes in his handwriting. It was proof he had entered the archive, proof he had seen everything. She realized with chilling certainty Jack wasn't protecting the family legacy, he was dismantling it. And then came the ultimate humiliation. Jack boarded the RMS Titanic in 1912, leaving behind a city in upheaval and a mother enraged. When the ship went down, Caroline didn't weep. Witnesses said she stared out her window for hours, unmoving, unblinking, as if willing the ocean itself to return her son, not in grief, but for vengeance. He had taken from her the one thing she could never retrieve, the balance of power. In Jack's absence, Caroline acted with cold fury. She summoned her remaining allies, the surviving relics of old society, and initiated what she called the Restoration. Families who had betrayed her were stripped from social registers, invitations rescinded, alliances shattered. She orchestrated a purge, subtle but final. Some went bankrupt, others fled to Europe, a few vanished altogether. Rumors whispered of suicides, of ruined reputations, of secret letters sent to newspapers at precisely the right time. Caroline didn't need to wield knives. Her words cut deeper, her silence condemned. But the world didn't stop changing. Cars replaced carriages, jazz replaced chamber music, women demanded votes. Her name no longer opened doors, it was a relic, a warning. And as New York rose into the modern age, Caroline prepared for her final move, a legacy etched not in stone, but in shadow. In the twilight of her reign, Caroline Astor no longer lived among people. She lived among phantoms. Her mansion, once a beacon of societal command, had become a fortress of memory and menace. Curtains were drawn at all hours. Servants moved like ghosts, whispering warnings in the darkened halls. The grand ballroom stood silent, preserved like tombs to a vanished order, but beneath the stillness, something darker simmered. Caroline began commissioning private investigators, not to protect herself but to gather secrets. She hired them to follow her rivals, to infiltrate emerging social circles, to dig into the pasts of men now rising to prominence. The files were stored in locked cabinets behind her study, each folder marked with a single letter, a system known only to her. These were not mere scandals, they were weapons, and she used them with precision. A financier exposed for fraud just days before his biggest merger. A senator disgraced after anonymous letters revealed his hidden debts. A publishing magnate's family torn apart by the sudden leak of photographs from a private affair. None could trace the source. All fell silent. But Caroline was no longer satisfied with maintaining power. She wanted to rewrite it. She approached museum curators, historical societies, newspaper editors, offering corrections to official records, names removed from registers, events recast. Her version of New York was becoming the only version. And yet, within her own home, the shadows grew bolder. Staff resigned in the night. Doors creaked open on their own. One maid claimed she saw Jack's reflection in a mirror, though he had been dead for over a decade. Caroline dismissed it as nonsense, but she had begun hearing voices, whispers in the corridors, footsteps behind her when none should be there. Her physician prescribed laudanum, but it dulled her grip on reality, and with it, her control. And then came the fire. In 1915, a blaze erupted in her private study, destroying a portion of the quiet book and several files. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but Caroline knew better. This was no accident. It was a message. Someone wanted to erase what she had preserved. Someone wanted the truth buried forever. As the embers cooled, Caroline stood amidst the ashes, clutching a scorched page with trembling hands. Her empire was cracking. The war was no longer outside, it was within. And in the smoldering wreckage she realized she was no longer the hunter, she was now the hunted. After the fire, Caroline Astor began to change. The formidable queen of society, once draped in silks and command, was now cloaked in something heavier, paranoia. Mirrors were covered, clocks stopped ticking. She believed time itself was rebelling against her. The marble mansion became a crypt, not for the dead but for secrets that refused to stay buried. She no longer trusted her inner circle. Longtime confidants were dismissed, their names struck from the ledgers. Even her surviving family members felt her distance grow into dread. Visitors described the house as suffocating, where every tick of the floorboards echoed with old guilt. But Caroline's grip on power had not loosened, it had merely turned inward. She now controlled the past. She ordered copies of society pages from decades ago, obsessively correcting, crossing out, rewriting events as she believed they should be remembered. Her version of history began to overwrite reality. And then came the letters. Unsigned, sealed in wax, delivered in the dead of night. Inside, fragments of truth. An anonymous photo of her daughter's body, rumored to have vanished into the sea. A page torn from her son's Titanic voyage journal, thought to be lost. A guest list from a ball that never officially occurred, with names that should not have been together. Each letter cracked open a wound she had tried to conceal. Each one whispered, "You cannot hide forever." Who sent them? No one could say. Caroline believed it was the new families, the descendants of those she had exiled from her world, seeking vengeance not in public but in shadows. Her fear turned to obsession. She ordered the excavation of old burial plots, searching for her daughter's remains. She paid fortune tellers and mystics to contact Jack, begging for a sign that he had survived. What she found instead was a deeper abyss. The investigators she hired returned with a single chilling fact. Her enemies weren't alive. Many of those she suspected had long since died. The letters, the whispers, the fire. They weren't coming from them. They were coming from inside her own legacy. Someone who knew the stories not from rumor, but from blood. Caroline looked into the mirror one final time, saw her own reflection staring back, and whispered a question that would haunt her final days. What if I have become the very ghost I feared? In that moment, the Queen of New York realized she was not preserving history, she was being consumed by it. In the weeks that followed, Caroline Astor vanished from public life. Newspapers speculated illness, but the truth was far more disturbing. Behind the sealed doors of her mansion, a different kind of decay had taken hold, not of the body, but of the mind. Servants reported her pacing the halls at night, murmuring names from the past, names long dead, as if summoning them to testify. Portraits of her ancestors were removed, not to be cleaned, but to be interrogated. "What did you see?" she would whisper beneath the flickering gaslight. One maid, brave enough to linger, swore she heard Caroline speak to the walls, accusing them of betrayal. "You let them in," she said. "You let them take everything." But who was them? Her mind, once razor-sharp in the calculus of society, now saw patterns in shadows, conspiracies in every footstep. She believed her home was being watched, not from the outside, but from within. Secret passages, long bricked over, were pried open. Forgotten rooms revealed relics, an old dress stained with blood, a ledger with names crossed out in red ink, and a letter from Jack dated the night before the Titanic sank. In it, he begged her forgiveness. "Mother, I know what you did. I know why she died." That letter never reached her hands until now. Caroline's hands trembled as she read the final line. "You tried to erase her, but the ocean does not forget." No name but Caroline knew. He meant his sister, the one who had drowned, whose death was ruled accidental. But Jack's words suggested a darker truth, that Caroline had orchestrated it, not out of malice but control. The perfect daughter had defied her, had loved someone unapproved, and in the ruthless order of Caroline's world, that meant exile, or worse. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in. She began to fear reflections, afraid her own image would reveal what she had hidden. Mirrors were shattered, covered in black cloth. Time ceased to move. The clock stopped, and so did the world inside her home. In her mind, New York still danced to her tune, but outside, the city had moved on. The Astor name now belonged to others, bankers, tycoons, builders of glass towers. Her empire, built of etiquette and exclusion, was crumbling in silence, and in that silence Caroline heard the truth. Her greatest crime was not the deaths or the betrayals. It was that she believed memory could be controlled, but memory, like the sea, always returns. But the truth did not stop at Caroline's doorstep. It spread like rot through the remaining halls of power. As her mind deteriorated, letters surfaced. Letters she had written, not to family, not to friends, but to men who called themselves the Council. These men did not appear in society pages. Their names weren't engraved in silver or carved in stone, but they ruled through whispers, through debt, through knowledge no one dared record. Caroline was one of them, or at least she believed herself to be. Her invitations had once opened the gates of society, but these letters suggested she had tried to open a different gate, one that led not to ballrooms, but to dominion. In the letters, she referenced rituals veiled as charitable events, where alliances were sealed not with toasts but with silence, where fortunes changed hands in exchange for loyalty, not to a cause, but to her will. "Order must be maintained," she wrote in one, "even if blood is the price of peace." Among these letters, a single document stood out, a guest list dated 5 years before Jack's death. It bore names, many crossed out. Next to each name, a symbol, a circle, a triangle, a dagger. Jack's name was there, so was his sister's, and next to hers, a dagger. Caroline's crime wasn't just that she shaped society, she sentenced it. Her gatherings were not merely social, they were trials, and those who failed her standards were removed, some through scandal, some through exile, others silently, permanently. It wasn't murder as we understand it, it was curation, an obsessive pursuit of legacy. The perfect family, the perfect city, but perfection when forced becomes tyranny. The deeper you looked into her life, the more the velvet fell away, revealing something ancient, something cruel. A system older than the Astors, older than New York itself, a belief that power was not taken but selected, And Caroline. He had named herself its arbiter. The council had tolerated her until she overreached, until the Titanic. That tragedy wasn't random. Jack had tried to flee, tried to expose her. The letter was his warning, the voyage his escape. But the ship, like her empire, sank under the weight of secrets. Caroline's descent into madness wasn't madness at all. It was knowledge, the unbearable truth that she had never been queen. She had been a pawn, permitted to rule only so long as she obeyed. And now, abandoned by both memory and masters, Caroline stood alone in the ruins of the world she had built. In the final winter of her life, Caroline was confined to her decaying mansion, its walls echoing with the fragments of a once mighty reign. Servants left one by one. Friends stopped calling. Her own name, once spoken in awe, was now uttered only in hushed tones, always with a glance over the shoulder as if summoning her memory might summon a curse. But Caroline did not speak of the past. She wandered the corridors at night, trailing gloved fingers along faded wallpaper, whispering names only she remembered. In the grand drawing room, portraits of her ancestors stared down, unmoved by her decline. She had preserved them all her life, yet now their gaze seemed cold, disapproving. In the fireplace, a stack of her ledgers sat untouched, records of power meticulously kept, names ranked, judged, erased, and beside them, locked in a velvet-lined chest, lay the final ledger. This one was different. It was not bound in leather, but wrapped in cloth stained with age and something darker. Inside were not society names, but ciphers, codes, and symbols, the language of the council. The ledger did not just track social transgressions. It recorded transactions of influence, threats neutralized, families silenced. Page after page listed not crimes but purges, men, women, even children, removed under her judgment, each marked with the same cold notation, no longer necessary. As the days grew shorter, Caroline stopped sleeping. She spoke to shadows, to reflections, to the ghost of her son Jack, who appeared to her not as the boy she had raised, but as the man she had destroyed. "You were meant to lead," she would whisper into the dark. "I made you perfect." But perfection had cost him everything, his freedom, his life, his soul. And now it was coming for her. The council had withdrawn their protection. The staff left overnight, food deliveries ceased, and soon the mansion stood silent, except for the creak of her footsteps and the soft rustle of that final ledger. One cold morning, neighbors reported smoke rising from the mansion's chimney, thick, black, unnatural. Firefighters forced their way in, but they found no blaze, only ashes smoldering in the hearth. The ledgers were gone, burned. Caroline sat alone, unmoving, staring into the embers. When they called her name, she did not respond. She was lost, not in madness, but in memory. Everything she had built was gone, consumed by the very silence she once commanded. In her final days, Caroline Astor became what she feared most. Forgotten. A relic. A warning. A name whispered only in nightmares. After Caroline's death, the Astor mansion was sealed. Officially, it was due to probate complications, inheritance disputes, and historical preservation arguments. But those who lived nearby spoke of something else, of city officials visiting at odd hours, of crates removed under armed guard, of whispers that the council had returned to claim what remained. The final ledger was presumed destroyed, but rumors circulated of a hidden vault beneath the mansion, accessible only through a coded mechanism embedded in the library floor. A retired servant who vanished shortly after speaking to a local journalist claimed Caroline kept the real records below ground, evidence of manipulation, social engineering, and orchestrated scandals stretching back decades. The mansion was eventually sold to a developer, but the project stalled indefinitely. Workers reported strange occurrences, tools disappearing, voices echoing from empty halls, and a thick, unplaceable scent that lingered in the air like burnt parchment and lavender. 2 men went missing in the basement and their bodies were never found. Soon after, the city declared the mansion structurally unsound. It was fenced off, the entrance chained, its windows boarded like a tomb. But the legend refused to die. In the years that followed, private collectors circulated pieces of Caroline's correspondence, letters sealed with her wax insignia, hinting at a shadow society that predated even her reign. One letter, addressed to an unnamed council elder, described a ritual of initiation involving not mere oaths but acts of loyalty. Acts that required sacrifice, of reputation, of blood, of truth. "The city obeys because it forgets," she wrote. "We reign because we remember." Beneath her signature was a sigil, a symbol combining the Astor crest with an unfamiliar mark, a serpent devouring its own tail, surrounded by 13 stars, Shoal. Ars tried to trace the symbol's origins, linking it to secret societies in early Dutch New York, even to the Freemasons, but none could confirm its meaning. What was clear, however, was that Caroline Astor had not simply ruled society. She had bent it, manipulated its very structure, its values, its memories, and in her final years, she had tried to destroy the evidence, to vanish her own influence. But the truth lingered, in ashes, in walls, in whispers, and somewhere beneath New York, in a vault no one could find, the real story of Caroline Astor waited, silent, buried, and very much alive. Because history, like power, never disappears. It waits. In 1920, a young journalist named Thomas Bell was sent by a failing New York paper to investigate the rumors surrounding the abandoned Astor mansion. Dismissed by his editors as a human interest distraction, Bell saw it differently. He had heard whispers from his grandfather, a former city clerk, about the Vault of the Matron, a hidden chamber beneath Manhattan's oldest estates where records of forbidden agreements and sealed judgments were kept. Bell wasn't just chasing a ghost story, he was hunting proof of a conspiracy that had never truly ended. Using old fire insurance maps, Bell traced the mansion's substructure, identifying a network of tunnels that connected several elite homes along Bond Street. These tunnels, he believed, had once allowed discreet passage between families, facilitating secret meetings shielded from the eyes of both the press and the public. One night, under the cover of rain, Bell bribed a night watchman and slipped into the mansion's decaying shell. Inside, time had stopped. The furniture remained draped, the air thick with mold and dust. But in the library, Bell found something chilling. The floor beneath the main desk was hollow. With effort, he pried up a section and discovered an iron trapdoor etched with symbols, serpent, star, and a single Latin phrase, "Veritas prohibita est." Truth is forbidden. He descended into darkness, his lantern flickering against stone walls lined with shelves. They held not books, but ledgers, hundreds of them, names, dates, transactions, and a list of symbols he didn't understand. In the center stood a pedestal with a sealed box, and within it, a leather-bound journal marked with Caroline's initials. Bell read only the first few pages before the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned, but no one was there. When he returned to the surface, the watchman was gone, and the door was chained shut from the outside. Bell escaped through a side window, the journal clutched in his coat. Days later, he returned to the newspaper with his findings. His editor called the story madness and refused to publish it. That night, Bell's apartment was ransacked, the journal stolen, and Bell vanished. His disappearance was never solved. Officially, he fled due to debts. Unofficially, some say he was silenced by men who still guarded the secrets of Caroline Astor, secrets too dangerous to be unearthed. The mansion was demolished a year later. But before the final stone fell, one worker swore he saw a woman in grey silk standing at the window, watching, waiting. Decades passed and the world changed. Skyscrapers clawed the sky, jazz echoed through Harlem, and Wall Street throbbed with ambition. But under the concrete skin of the city, the old bones of Caroline's world remained. In 1973, during construction for a new office tower on Bond Street, workers unearthed a sealed chamber beneath the site, an irregular stone room untouched by time. Inside, they found rotted ledgers, fragments of silverware, and one intact item, a portrait of Caroline Astor. Her face stared through cracked varnish, untouched by decay. The city quickly intervened. The site was closed, workers reassigned, and an official statement claimed it was an old storage vault from the 1800s, nothing more. But rumors rippled. A local historian, Eleanor Hart, began her own investigation, believing the chamber was part of what she called the Forgotten Grid, a hidden network of elite passageways that once underpinned Manhattan's ruling class. Hart's research led her to a long-abandoned storage facility near the East River, where she located shipping manifests under the name A. Schermerhorn, Caroline's father. The manifests listed strange cargo, oak crates labeled Relic A, Relic B, and Pax Memoriam. No descriptions, no destinations, just dates and initials. Hart cross-referenced the dates and uncovered a disturbing pattern. Each corresponded to a major death or scandal in New York high society. The suicide of a prominent banker's wife, the sudden disappearance of a rival heiress, the fire that destroyed the Fish estate. Hart believed these relics weren't objects, they were evidence, trophies of control. But her most damning discovery came when she traced Caroline's lineage to a shadowy trust, still operational, still funneling money through shell estates, all controlled by a private board with no public presence. She found only one name associated repeatedly: Akroton, as decades, M.A. initials that appeared in ledgers dating back to the 1860s. Some said it stood for Mrs. Astor. Others believed it was a pseudonym, an identity passed from woman to woman, generation to generation. Hart attempted to publish her findings, but her work was discredited, her career ruined by sudden accusations of fraud. Days before her death in 1981, she mailed her research to a journalist in Boston. The package arrived empty. Only a single note remained unsigned. Some women rule from the shadows. Some shadows never lift. Caroline Astor had been dead for over 70 years. Yet her world, the one she built in silence with judgment and precision, refused to die. And perhaps it never had. What if Caroline Astor didn't merely preside over society? What if she orchestrated something deeper, more enduring, something that still governs from behind the curtain? After Hart's mysterious death, whispers began surfacing among New York's preservation circles. The Bond Street house, now a hollowed shell of its former grandeur, had been purchased in the 1990s by a private entity called the Order of Silent Names. No tax records, no public tours, just a single plaque on the door. Private residence, no entry. But construction crews in the area spoke of strange requests. Soundproof walls, reinforced basements, antique furnishings brought in under cover of darkness. One worker claimed he saw a room recreated exactly like a 19th century parlor, complete with calling cards arranged on a silver tray. He was fired the next day. Meanwhile, in the archives of Grace Church, a curator uncovered a sealed pew registry dated 1865. Most of the names were familiar, but beside Caroline's family pew, a later entry appeared, dated 1921, long after her death. The name was illegible, but the initials were there again, M.A., and beside it, a note in faded ink, "Endures through the veil." The curator tried to investigate, but church leadership denied the existence of the registry. When she returned to the archive, the ledger was gone. Beneath these vanishing traces, a darker theory began to form. Caroline had not just maintained power through lineage or wealth, she had weaponized memory. By controlling remembrance, what was preserved, what was erased, she became not just a social arbiter, but a guardian of perception itself. The Astor Family Trust still funds historic societies, libraries, and restoration efforts across the eastern seaboard. But every donation comes with one condition: editorial control. Monuments are curated, archives altered, names polished or discarded, and the past, the terre past, is remade in the image of Caroline's silence. Some believe the Order of Silent Names is no mere social club. It's a custodial network, maintaining a vision of society dictated by a woman who understood that the greatest power is not seen or shouted. It is endured, inherited, and enforced through decorum, reputation, and erasure. Those who attempt to unveil it, like Eleanor Hart, vanish from the record. Those who comply are rewarded with position, protection, and the illusion of choice. Caroline Astor may have died, but her war never ended. It simply moved underground. And those who walk the velvet-lined halls of power today, they walk through doors she first opened, under her gaze, beneath her law. But the question remains, how could one woman, cloaked in silken silence, cast a shadow so vast that it still distorts the present? The answer lies in her greatest weapon, not wealth, not lineage, but ritual. Caroline Astor understood that power was not declared, it was performed. Every gesture, every event, every invitation was part of a choreography designed to condition the minds of those around her, to align them to a system where control felt like tradition and subjugation felt like refinement. The 400, her infamous list of acceptable families, was not merely a social register, it was a mechanism of psychological control. Inclusion was not about belonging, it was about obedience. Those listed were bound by unspoken rules: who they could marry, where they could live, how they could speak, who they could be. Those outside the list were non-entities, social ghosts, and as Caroline aged, her control intensified. The opulent balls at her Fifth Avenue mansion were not celebrations, they were tests of loyalty, of decorum, of submission. Attendees were watched, catalogued, and evaluated. A misplaced word, a clumsy gesture, a poorly timed entrance, and your family could vanish from relevance for a generation. Some families never recovered. But behind this intricate social theater was something older, something primordial. Caroline's diaries, smuggled from the Astor estate by a maid in 1894, speak of her belief in what she called the eternal order. She wrote of dreams in which names were etched in stone, and the faces of the forgotten wept behind mirrors. She described rituals passed down from the old families, secret gatherings beneath Grace Church, where silence was not absence but presence, where memory was an offering and forgetting was a punishment. These entries were dismissed as the ramblings of an aging matriarch, but the maid who revealed them disappeared. Weeks later, her body found in the Hudson ruled an accident, and the diary, lost in a fire at the archive where it was briefly stored. Yet fragments survive, enough to suggest that Caroline Astor believed she was not merely a woman in history, but a steward of something outside time, something that required guardians. Silent ones, and if the order still exists and if they still shape the narrative of history, then the velvet tyranny of Caroline Astor is not a relic of the past. It is the architecture of the world we still inhabit, unseen but absolute, because power that is spoken can be challenged, power that is remembered never dies. The deeper you descend into Caroline Astor's shadow, the more the line between history and ritual dissolves. This wasn't high society, it was a labyrinth, a cloister of whispered alliances, quiet punishments, and the constant recalibration of control. And at the heart of it all, one woman who never raised her voice but could still silence a city. But beneath her composed exterior, a different storm brewed, one of betrayal, of blood, of secrets too heavy even for the chandeliers of Fifth Avenue. Caroline's husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., was no loyal consort. He spent more time aboard his yacht, the Ambassadress, than in their home, and those who boarded that vessel came back altered, or didn't come back at all. Rumors circulated of gatherings on the open sea, powerful men, veiled women, and deals that could never withstand daylight. Caroline knew, she always knew, but silence was her weapon. She endured, not out of weakness but calculation. To expose him would expose her and the control she had over the city's soul. Instead, she tightened her grip. Her daughters bore the weight of that decision. One, Carrie, fled to Europe and was found in a Paris hotel room, her death labeled an overdose. Another, Charlotte, vanished from public life after her sister's death, drowned not in water but in grief and shame. And her only son, John Jacob Astor IV, the heir, boarded the Titanic. What the public was told, a tragic loss, a national mourning. But what the newspapers didn't print was this: John Jacob was carrying with him a sealed leather portfolio. Witnesses claimed he clutched it tightly as the ship went down. A family ledger, a map, a record of debts. We'll never know. It was never recovered. Caroline never spoke of it. But her face, when informed of his death, was not that of a grieving mother. It was the expression of a sovereign watching an empire crack. From that moment, her power waned. The world was changing, The old rituals frayed. The newcomers, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, didn't play her game. They built glass towers instead of marble fortresses. They traded in speed, not silence. Caroline Astor, the queen of memory, was now ruling shadows in a city addicted to light. But before she died, she made one final move. In 1908, she summoned a select group to her mansion for what was said to be her last great dinner. No press were allowed, no notes were taken. Every guest who attended vanished from public life within a year. Some say it was coincidence. Others whisper it was the final meeting of the order, a passing of the torch, or perhaps the sealing of a curse. The blank calling card was dismissed as an artifact, an oddity left behind in the dust of old stone and copper wiring. But the man who found it, a janitor named Marcus Bell, couldn't let it go. He took it home, curious, unaware that some things are not meant to be held, let alone pocketed. That night, he didn't sleep. The moment he placed the card on his nightstand, the temperature in his apartment dropped, despite it being mid-July. His clock stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m., and then came the knocking. 3 distinct knocks on his apartment door, slow and deliberate. He opened it to an empty hallway, but the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. The card had changed. Where once there was only Caroline's name, now there were numbers, coordinates etched in red ink. Marcus followed them obsessively. They led him to the Manhattan Municipal Archives, to a forgotten vault beneath the city's grid. He was not the first to seek the truth. His name now joins a long list of men drawn to the whisper of Caroline's power. Inside the vault, he found the remnants of a ledger. Not a financial one, but a social record. Names, addresses, dates, and beside certain entries a symbol, a dagger wrapped in velvet. These names were familiar. Powerful men, founders of banks, builders of railroads, judges and senators, all marked, all connected, all bound to Caroline's influence long after her death. One page was marked differently. At the top a title, The Order of Stillness. It described a circle of 12, leaders who preserved the old order, who ensured memory endured and chaos was contained. The ritual of silence, of memory, of control. The order did not die with Caroline. It survived, moving through generations, adapting, hiding behind new names, new towers, new institutions. The velvet tyranny of the Gilded Age was not buried, it evolved. Marcus tried to speak, but within days of his discovery, he vanished. His apartment was emptied. No family came forward. His name was wiped from payroll, from public records. Only one thing remained, a single calling card, mailed anonymously to a local journalist. On it, 2 words had appeared beneath Caroline's name, "Still watching." This is not just a story of old New York. This is a warning. The velvet curtain has never fallen. It only shifted. Behind it, the watchers remain, waiting, ensuring that power never truly slips from the hands of those who claimed it first. And those who see too much, they become footnotes, shadows, erased from the ledger forever. That journalist, Adrian Wolfe, wasn't the kind of man to scare easily. A former war correspondent turned investigative writer, he had seen enough darkness to steel his nerves. But when he received that calling card in a plain envelope, no return address, no note, something in him shifted. The paper felt ancient, not just old, and the ink. It shimmered faintly under the light, as if it didn't want to be read, only remembered. He traced Marcus Bell's steps, discovering that the janitor had made multiple calls before his disappearance, one to a historian specializing in Gilded Age social structures, another to a retired archivist who once worked in City Hall's basement levels. Both were now unreachable. One had died of a sudden stroke. The other was listed as moved, no forwarding address. Wolfe knew patterns, and this wasn't coincidence. He followed the coordinates again, not to the vault, but to an estate, abandoned, crumbling and heavily gated, once owned by the Fish family. Here, Mamie Fish, Caroline Astor's greatest rival, had hosted those strange, mocking gatherings where monkeys wore suits and rules were shattered with laughter. Wolfe crossed the threshold of that rotting mansion, flashlight in hand. The walls whispered, literally. Faint voices muffled, coming from nowhere and everywhere. He found a ballroom, decayed but preserved in the way time does when it's held captive. On the ceiling, painted frescoes, 12 figures seated around a table, their faces obscured by masks. One wore a crown of velvet. On the floor beneath it, another ledger. But this one wasn't just names. It was rituals, dates of observances, names of guests welcomed, and beside them, the same symbol Marcus had seen, the velvet-wrapped dagger. And beneath it all, a final page. The silence must endure. Wolf photographed everything. Hours later, his apartment was ransacked. His files gone. His hard drives destroyed. Only one image survived, stored off-site, the fresco of the 12 masked figures. He released it online, buried in an unrelated article, labeled only as Unknown Gilded Age Artwork. Within days, he received a call. A woman's voice, calm, elegant, cold. "You're searching for Caroline," she said. "She's still here. We all are." Then the line went dead. Wolf didn't sleep that night. Outside his window, a black carriage idled in silence. The next morning, the fresco image had been removed from every platform, every archive. Wolf's account, deleted. Caroline's ledger, gone. But one thing remained in his mailbox. A fresh calling card. Caroline Astor. And beneath it, this time, a new phrase. "You've been seen." Adrian Wolf knew what that card meant. This wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. Or perhaps a summons. He wasn't dealing with memory or myth. He was entangled in something still alive. Alive in the shadows of marble halls, hidden beneath the skin of a city that thought itself modern, free, immune to the ghosts of power. But New York was never free. It was built to be owned. And Caroline Astor? She had never truly left. That night, Wolf didn't go home. He went underground. Not metaphorically, literally. Into the forgotten tunnels beneath the city, guided by the coordinates Bell had left behind, tracing the sewer maps, disused subway lines, and the whispered paths that old city workers once spoke of, routes the city planners never acknowledged. Below Manhattan, where darkness thickened and time slowed, he found it. A door carved into stone, older than the grid, older than the Dutch foundations, older than memory. It bore no handle, only a crest. The Schermerhorn crest. Caroline's bloodline. Beside it, a lock, not for a key but for a hand. Wolf placed his palm against it. The door hissed. Stone slid, dust rained, and the city above fell silent. Inside, a chamber lit faintly by gas lamps still burning, their flames low and unnaturally blue. On the walls, portraits, not painted, but etched into the stone itself, faces of power, unmoving, watching. At the chamber's center, a table, velvet-covered. Upon it, a single object, a mirror. But this was no ordinary glass. As Wolf approached, the surface rippled, like water reflecting not the present but something beneath it. He looked in, and what stared back was not his reflection. It was Caroline. Ageless, serene, merciless. Her lips did not move, but her voice entered his mind like ice. "You sought truth, but truth is not given. It is earned, at a cost." Behind him, the chamber door sealed. Wolf's breath caught. On the mirror's surface, images flickered. Every decision he'd made, every moment of doubt, every weakness laid bare. And then, her eyes locked onto his. "You are the ledger now," she said. "What you see you must carry. What you know you must never speak, or you become forgotten." And in that moment, Wolf understood. This wasn't history. This was inheritance. A burden passed hand to hand, generation to generation, through rituals, through blood. He wasn't the first to find her. He wouldn't be the last. But now, he belonged to her. Caroline Astor, the queen who ruled not by presence but by memory, by fear, by silence. The chamber was not just a tomb of memory, it was an archive of dominion, a vault where power was preserved in forms beyond paper or stone. Wolf's heart raced as the flickering images continued in the mirror. Scenes from the Gilded Age and beyond, moments not recorded in any history book. He saw the original list, the one Bell mentioned, the true ledger of New York's bloodlines. It was not merely a record of names, but of ownership, land, influence, allegiance, names that still graced buildings, universities, banks. Every titan of industry, every politician of note, all traced back to this room, to Caroline's hand. She had written their futures, and in doing so, chained their descendants to her legacy. And then, the crimes. Hidden beneath layers of etiquette and lace, Wolf saw the transactions sealed in blood, forced marriages, institutional murders, disappearances covered by polite silence. He saw Alva Vanderbilt's humiliation at Caroline's hands, a strategic destruction of reputation so complete it drove Alva to madness. He saw Mamie Fish's debauched parties, not merely rebellion, but a calculated distraction while land deals and betrayals happened in secret rooms. And then, something darker. Wolf's own family name appeared, not in the ledgers of power but in the margins, debtors. His ancestors had once been powerful, but Caroline had erased them. A single stroke in her ledger and generations of ambition were reduced to silence and shame. Wolf realized why he had been drawn to this. It wasn't just curiosity, it was blood calling blood, a reckoning long deferred. The room pulsed now with a low hum, as if the very walls recognized him, acknowledged him as both intruder and heir. He staggered back from the mirror, but the images followed, now etched into his mind. Caroline's voice again, no longer cold but commanding. "You are not free, Adrian Wolf. You are bound to speak is to destroy, to act is to ascend." In his hand, the invitation card began to burn, though no flame touched it. Symbols appeared, old, forgotten sigils of authority. He was being marked to enter the game of silent rulers, the custodians of control. The room began to darken. Wolf turned, searching for escape, but the chamber offered none. Only a single staircase upward, narrow and steep, vanishing into blackness. He climbed, each step echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. Behind him, the mirror's final image froze. Caroline's face, watching, waiting. And below it, a phrase etched into stone. "Power endures in silence. Speak and perish." Wolf now carried the burden and the choice. As Wolf ascended the narrow staircase, each step felt like a negotiation with fate. The air grew colder, more metallic, and the walls around him narrowed as if resisting his passage. He gripped the iron railing, its surface strangely warm, pulsing with something alive. At the top, a wooden door waited, its frame carved with symbols he had seen only once, on the burning invitation now seared into his memory. He pushed it open. A vast room stretched before him, circular, domed, and silent as a tomb. At the center stood a long table set for 12, each place marked with a gold nameplate, but the chairs were empty. On the wall behind them, portraits loomed, figures from centuries past, cloaked not in robes, but in tailored suits, gowns, uniforms of influence. Caroline's portrait was the largest, but it wasn't a painting, it was a photograph, somehow pristine though impossibly old. Her eyes locked onto Wolf, alive with cold knowing. He stepped forward, the floor beneath him creaking like ancient timbers, and as he approached the table he noticed the names: Rockwell, Morgan, Astor, Roosevelt, and his own, Wolf. The plate was there, dulled with age but unmistakable. Adrian's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a council, it was a covenant. The room wasn't abandoned. It was waiting for the next generation to take its place. On the table lay a thick book bound in human leather. He knew it without touching. The ledger, Caroline's true legacy. It called to him. He opened it. Inside, not words, but signatures. Blood signatures, stretching across generations, tied to oaths, to silence, to allegiance. It was a binding contract of power, forged in secrecy. Adrian flipped to the last page, blank, except for a pen resting atop it. A pen made of bone, Above it a phrase, "To claim the seat, sign and forget." Forget what? His identity, his past, his freedom? The hum of the chamber deepened into a growl, and behind him a figure emerged, an old man in a tailored black suit, eyes clouded with age, but voice sharp as razors. "Your blood brought you here," he whispered. "Your name demands it. Sign and ascend. Refuse and vanish." Wolf trembled, the pen in his hand now impossibly heavy. Every instinct screamed to run, to burn the ledger, to shatter the silence. But another voice echoed in his mind, Caroline's. "Power is not granted. It is taken and kept." Wolf now stood at the edge of becoming, the edge of obliteration. What he chose next would not only define him, it would define history itself. The chamber waited, silent, watching, judging. The weight of the pen in Wolf's hand felt more than physical. It was ancestral. It was history, centuries thick, pressing down on his breath, his bones, his soul. Before him the blank page shimmered not with light but with shadow, as if it absorbed everything around it. The figure behind him stepped closer, the air between them charged, electric, heavy with unspoken menace. "Sign," the old man said, voice dry as dust, "and you will never fear again." Wolf's mind spiraled. This was not merely a choice between wealth and obscurity. It was a ritual, a transaction of identity. Every man before him who had signed had become more than mortal, but less than human. He looked again at the names on the table. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie. Names etched into buildings, laws, wars. But beneath their power had always been silence, veils, shadows. Wolf's fingers twitched. He thought of his father's cold detachment, his mother's distant sorrow. He thought of the cemetery, of the crypt, of Caroline's eyes watching from every wall. This room had shaped him long before he'd ever walked into it. He knew now, this was not just a family legacy. It was a control system, psychological, generational, unbreakable, unless he broke it. "What happens if I don't sign?" Wolf whispered. The old man paused, his lips curling into something between pity and threat. "Then you die as you are. Unknown. Forgotten. A failure to the blood." Wolf's pulse thundered. He stepped back. The book seemed to breathe. The room darkened. The walls pulsed. This place was alive. It fed on allegiance. He could feel its hunger now. He saw visions. Wars orchestrated from this table. Markets crashed and raised. Kings made and unmade. All decided in rooms like this. Not with guns or armies, but with names, signatures, obedience. Wolf's gaze locked on Caroline's portrait. Her lips seemed to move. "There is no escape." Her voice echoed in his mind. Only acceptance or destruction. Wolf turned, heart racing. "Then destroy me," he whispered. And in that instant the chamber groaned. The lights dimmed. The old man lunged forward, but Wolf was already moving. He ripped the ledger from the table and hurled it into the fireplace. The flames exploded, green and unnatural, roaring as if something ancient screamed. The old man shrieked, not in pain but in fury, as the walls trembled. Wolf stumbled back as the floor cracked, the chandelier above crashing down, shattering in a burst of sparks. The legacy was burning, the past was collapsing, and Adrian Wolf, blood heir, last of the line, chose not to inherit it, but to destroy it. The fire was not ordinary. It hissed with a language of its own, an ancient tongue woven into the very marrow of the Grimsbane estate. The flames licked the walls like hands desperate to pull everything into their fury. Wolf stood frozen, watching the ledger burn, the ink of centuries boiling off the pages, releasing a stench not of paper, but of decay, of something far older than parchment and pen. The old man screamed again, but this time his voice faltered, cracking like glass. His skin paled, veins darkened, eyes wide with a terror not of death but of obliteration. "You fool," he choked, staggering backward. "Do you know what you've done?" Wolf didn't answer. He felt it, a shift in the air, a rending of something unseen. The walls of the chamber rippled like skin over bone. The portraits of ancestors began to blacken, eyes hollowing, mouths curling in silent screams. Caroline's image burned slowest. Her face melted not in agony, but in fury. She had built this kingdom, this machine of manners and memory, and now her final descendant had chosen ruin over reign. Wolf stumbled out of the chamber as beams cracked and the ceiling began to collapse. Smoke poured down the marble hallway, curling like vipers around the gilded banisters. He passed rooms filled with artifacts, gilded mirrors that reflected twisted versions of himself, books bound in leather worn smooth by centuries of hands seeking control. He reached the grand staircase, but it was no longer a staircase. It was a gauntlet. The banisters writhed, the floor beneath him warping like flesh. Every step was a betrayal, every breath a rebellion. He heard voices, echoes of the past. Caroline, his father, the whispering cabal that had shaped New York from the shadows. "The world is not ruled by force," they hissed, "but by inheritance, by those who understand the cost of silence." Wolf burst through the front door, was into the cold night air. The estate behind him blazed like a cathedral to a fallen god. He didn't stop, not to watch, not to mourn. He ran, into the woods, into the darkness, into the unknown. Behind him the legacy crumbled, and something within him cracked open. He was no longer Wolf of the Grimsbanes. He was no longer a name. He was no longer theirs. He was free, or so he believed. But the old blood is never done. It waits, and it remembers. The fire consumed Grimsbane Hall, but not everything within it was ash. Beneath the ruins, beneath the scorched stone and melted glass, something ancient stirred. As Wolf disappeared into the forest's edge miles away, men watched. Not firemen, not police, not neighbors. They arrived in unmarked black carriages, their wheels silent on the roads, their eyes cold, emotionless, calculating. They did not try to extinguish the flames. They waited until the estate was reduced to embers, then descended upon it like carrion birds. Among them, a man in a dark overcoat, his gloved hands holding an iron key, the kind that unlocked not doors but decisions. He knelt among the ruins, brushing aside soot and bone, revealing a scorched blackened seal, the Grimsbane family crest. He traced it, then rose, silent. "The bloodline has broken," one man said beside him. The other shook his head slowly. "No, the bloodline has gone dark. It always does when one disobeys." Wolf ran for 3 days. Through the forest, across the old roads, past the towns that had long whispered the Grimsbane name like a curse. He was changed, his hands blackened from soot, his face cut by branches. But his eyes were wide open. For the first time, he saw the world not through privilege, not through legacy, but through fear. At night he heard them, the voices, Caroline's whisper, his father's orders, the chant of the brotherhood whose names he now understood were never meant to be known. Power had a price, and Wolf had refused to pay. He found shelter in an abandoned chapel deep in the woods, its windows shattered, its altar cracked. There, beneath a sky of thunder, he opened his father's final journal, rescued from the fire in that last moment. Inside, the truth unfolded. His family had not merely ruled society, they had engineered it, through marriages arranged in blood, through charities designed to launder influence, through secrets buried in plain sight. Every major institution, banks, schools, churches, had once bowed to the silent will of Caroline and her heirs, but in the margins of that journal, in the slanted, hurried script of his father's final days, Wolf read the warning. "If you do not become the Grimsbane, they will create another who will." It was not inheritance, it was occupation. Wolf was never meant to have a choice, but now, with the legacy in flames and his blood still his own, he had one decision left: to disappear, or to fight the system that had tried to own him. And far away, beneath the city streets, the old society stirred, realizing its greatest weapon had gone rogue. Wolf did not sleep that night. The rain fell hard against the shattered roof of the chapel, washing over the ruined altar where dust and time had clung for decades. He sat alone, the journal open in his lap. the final lines of his father's confessions seared into his mind like a brand. They will come for you, not because you are special, but because you walked away. Outside, the darkness was no longer simply night, it was surveillance. The woods around him whispered not with wind, but with watchers. Wolf knew the Brotherhood would not tolerate betrayal. He was no longer their heir, he was their threat. In the quiet before dawn, he made a choice. He would not run, not anymore. He began to trace the names in the journal, the connections, the networks of power and corruption that had been cloaked in philanthropy, in charity, and civic duty. The Grimsbanes were not a family, they were a system, and every system had a beginning, a weakness. Wolf's hands shook as he reached a name buried deep in the footnotes of the journal, one he had never heard spoken in the marble halls of the manor. Elias Mather, a man erased from the family tree, stricken from all records. Next to the name, only 2 words: the architect. Wolf knew what he had to do. He left the chapel as dawn broke, moving south toward the oldest parts of the city, where the Grimsbane control had first taken root, where secrets were kept in stone and shadow. The streets had changed. Steel towers now pierced the sky, neon lights drowned the stars, but beneath the surface the old ways persisted. In the archives of the Historical Society, a building so old it seemed immune to time, Wolf sought the architect. Through dusty ledgers, forbidden census records, and sealed vaults, he began to piece together a forgotten history. Elias Mather had been more than just an ancestor. He had founded the society that governed the Grimsbane legacy. He was the origin of the Velvet Tyranny, and in 1832 he vanished after creating something called the Directive. Wolf found it, a manifesto hidden within a hollowed-out Bible in the Grimsbane private collection, detailing not just control of wealth, but control of minds. Education, religion, law, each a tool, each a means of shaping belief, behavior, and submission. Wolf realized with horror that the world he had known, the world he thought he had escaped, was only a fraction of the machine. The Grimsbanes had not merely ruled, they had programmed society itself, and now the program was searching for him. Wolf emerged from the archives as the sun bled into the sky like a wound, his face pale and drawn, reflected in the glass of every building he passed, a man marked by knowledge no one was meant to carry. He gripped the Directive tightly under his coat, knowing that this fragile manuscript was a threat not just to the Grimsbane dynasty, but to the illusion that surrounded all of them. He was no longer merely uncovering history. He was dismantling a system that had imprisoned generations in gilded chains. But as he walked the streets of old New York, something shifted. People turned to stare, not with recognition, but with awareness. He wasn't anonymous anymore. The Grimsbane name, whispered in fear, had marked him. And now, those who served the legacy, quiet men in suits, watchful eyes behind tinted windows, were closing in. That night, Wolf returned to the Grimsbane mausoleum, a vault of cold stone where the family dead had been buried for centuries. He descended into its depths with the Directive in hand, seeking the truth he sensed was buried with Elias Mather himself. The air was thick with decay and silence. And then he found it. A sealed chamber beneath the main crypt, its entrance hidden behind an iron gate inscribed with Latin, Fiat Silentium. Let there be silence. Inside, the walls were lined not with caskets, but with documents, archives of every move the Grimsbanes had made over centuries. Marriages arranged for power, deaths disguised as accidents, institutions manipulated from within. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal. Upon it, a mirror framed in bone. Wolf approached and saw his reflection, worn, haunted, but awake. And carved beneath the mirror was an inscription, "The architect sees all." Wolf turned to leave, but he wasn't alone. In the shadows stood a man he'd never met but instantly recognized, Jonathan Vale, the current executor of the Grimsbane legacy, a ghost in a tailored suit. "You've seen too much," Vale said quietly. "And now you have a choice. Return and take your place, or burn with what you know." Wolf held up the Directive. "The world deserves to see this." Vale smiled coldly. "The world isn't ready. Truth is a burden, Control is mercy. Wolf stared at the man, and something inside him shifted again. Not fear, but resolve. Then let them choose. In that moment, he knew there was no going back. The war wasn't for money, it wasn't for power. It was for reality itself. Wolf's breath echoed in the tomb like the last remnants of a dying age. In front of him, Vale stood still, silent, unreadable, a sentinel of the old order. Around them, the walls of the Grimsbane crypt whispered with the ghosts of control. Wolf gripped the directive like a weapon, knowing that truth once seen was a force more dangerous than any blade. The people, Wolf began, live under illusions. They trust the stories written for them, the systems built around them, the families like yours that feed on obedience and ignorance. Vale's eyes flicked to the pedestal, to the mirror framed in bone, and then back to Wolf. And you believe you're different, that exposing this ends the game. The moment you speak, you vanish. Your name erased, your life replaced by a cautionary tale. They'll call you mad, obsessed. The story will be rewritten before your voice echoes twice. Wolf stepped forward. Maybe. But maybe one voice cracks the silence. Maybe that's enough. Vale's face remained unreadable, but something in his gaze flickered, a hint of fear, or perhaps recognition. You want the world to change, he whispered. The world doesn't change. It obeys. Wolf realized then that Vale wasn't simply a guardian of the Grimsbane legacy. He was a prisoner of it, trapped in a lineage that consumed its own to maintain control. The true crime wasn't merely the manipulation of power. It was the systematic annihilation of freedom, generation after generation trading truth for order. Wolf reached for the candle near the crypt wall, flame flickering in his trembling hand. Then let them see what obedience costs. He held the flame to the old parchment of the directive. Vale's eyes widened as fire licked across centuries of silence. You fool, he hissed, stepping forward. That knowledge lives in me now, Wolf interrupted. You can kill paper, but you can't kill memory. The piece. Directive turned to ash, but Wolf walked past Vale, past the line of the dead, past the stone that had once sealed their crimes. He emerged into the dawn of a city that no longer looked the same. For him, reality had split. Behind every window, every suit, every handshake, he now saw the machinery of control. He had nothing, no wealth, no allies, no safety. But he had seen the core. The question now was, who would believe him? And who would try to stop him before the world awoke to the war they never saw coming? Wolf knew from the moment the ashes of the directive slipped through his fingers that the battle wasn't won. It had only begun. The war for truth, the war for memory, was never fought in grand arenas but in shadows, in whispers, in the spaces between what was seen and what was believed. He wandered the city as a man unmoored. Everywhere he looked, the architecture of deception stood tall. Banks, museums, courthouses, each a monument to stories curated by families like the Grimsbanes, facades covering centuries of blood bargains and psychological conditioning. The people moved like clockwork, eyes dulled by comfort and repetition. Wolf's revelations had become a burden he couldn't share. He wrote at first, notes, diagrams, connections. Names that had once seemed irrelevant now glared with significance. Politicians with ties to ancestral trusts, corporations descended from shadow consortiums, universities teaching sanitized history beneath stained glass windows funded by old money. And always the Grimsbanes, a name erased from textbooks but stamped in the substructures of power. He tried to speak publicly once. A small hall, a gathered crowd of skeptics and seekers. He told them about the directive, about Caroline Astor's shadow empire, about the manipulation of society through lineage and fear. The next morning, every trace of the event was gone. The venue denied hosting him. His recording equipment had vanished. Online mentions were scrubbed, accounts closed, warnings delivered in polite but unyielding legal letters. He wasn't silenced violently, that would be too obvious. No, he was erased softly, strategically, like a chess piece removed before a move was made. One evening, Wolf returned to his apartment to find it undisturbed, except for a single envelope on his desk. Inside was a photograph. Vale Grimsbane standing beneath a new plaque at the Metropolitan Museum.